Today at the National Press Club, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Chris Bowen, on Labor's climate change policy and the job opportunities in the climate crisis. That's Chris Bowen delivering today's National Press Club address in Canberra.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name's Tom Connell. I'm a director here at the Press Club and also a political host and reporter at Sky News. Today's guest, of course, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen. His speech is entitled "The World's Climate Emergency, Australia's Jobs Opportunity." It has become a cliche to talk about climate change in Australia bedevilling the major parties in particular. It has, on the coalition side, been a key factor to them losing leaders. On the Labor side, though, it's been a key factor in them losing elections. In other words, no pressure. If you are following the conversation online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust. Our hashtag is NPC. Everyone, please welcome Chris Bowen.
In acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, let us also acknowledge some truths. Aboriginal people, as we know, have a special connection to their country. That makes the impacts of climate change a particularly important issue for our First Nations people. We must also acknowledge that climate change can and will worsen existing inequalities. Think of the impact of increased natural disasters, flood and cyclone in remote communities where housing is already poor, where isolation may be increased even further. Think also of the acute impact of rising sea levels on our Torres Strait Island brothers and sisters, who are already seeing sites of cultural significance literally washed away before their eyes. So in acknowledging the stewardship of our First Nations people over our lands and waters for millennia, let us also acknowledge the impact of climate change is another one of the many issues for which First Nations people deserve a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Australian Parliament. I also want to acknowledge some special guests here today. I'm honoured that the Chief Minister of the ACT, my friend Andrew Barr, is joining us. Under his leadership, the ACT is delivering one of Australia's most ambitious climate agendas, with a commitment to net zero by 2045. He's also joined by two of my federal colleagues, his predecessor, the former Chief Minister of the ACT, and it's a pleasure and honour to sit around the Shadow Cabinet table with Katie Gallagher, with the experience that she brings to bear in those discussions, and Alicia Payne, who will have an important role to play in Labor governments for many years to come. I also want to acknowledge Pat Conroy in particular. Pat is the Shadow Minister assisting me for climate change, and he was integrally involved in developing the policy we announced last week. He brings a valuable insight as a regional MP representing an area which is at the focal point of the transition in energy underway. Also, as Shadow Minister for International Development in the Pacific, he has developed a first-class understanding of the challenges and opportunities of climate change in our region. He's a valued colleague and friend. For many years, particularly under John Howard, Australia's approach to climate change policy was governed by the principle of no regrets. This was the concept that any potential action should be governed by the principle of not regretting the economic cost of that action. The irony, however, is that that approach has left Australia with plenty to regret. Australia, which has so often prided itself on punching above our weight on big issues, has been weighed down by dysfunctional politics, by the politics of division, resulting in a pathetic lack of ambition for our country and an embarrassing lack of action. While we were told that we would regret the economic cost of action, we've ended up regretting that Australia has missed out on so much economic opportunity. More petajoules of sun hit our landmass each year than any other country. Our wind resource is some of the best in the world as well. We're an energy exporting country, meaning we have the skills and expertise to lead the transformation to renewable energy. Australia, which has for so long searched for areas of comparative advantage, has for the better part of 2 decades taken a pass on a comparative advantage staring us in the face. We could have by now been well on the way to becoming a renewable energy superpower. Of course we still can be, but we've left our run so very late, and we don't have a day to waste in catching up. Far too many deniers and delayers have run the toxic but effective fear campaign about the economic costs of climate action, and far too many are doing so still today. In a crowded field, the tactics of Scott Morrison at the last election win the prize for being the low point of sophistry and toxicity. Australians were told that action on climate change would come at a cost to the economy of billions of dollars. Instead of being treated to a contest of ideas, a genuine contest of ideas about how to lead the transition to renewable energy, the job opportunities in that transition, the Australian people were subjected to weeks of disinformation about how action would cost their jobs, their community, and even their weekend. Now, having sniffed the winds of political change with too many of their own MPs under mortal threat from voters fed up with lies about climate change, Scott Morrison and the LNP want us to believe that they are the party to be trusted with this economic transformation. Seriously. The guy who warned that electric cars would end the weekend, the guy who claimed that big batteries are as effective as a big banana or a big prawn, who derided renewable energy targets as nuts. These guys, including Josh Frydenberg as Energy Minister, who attempted to derail and destroy South Australia's world-leading transformation to renewable energy, these guys reckon they are the team to manage this massive economic transformation. And arguably, the even greater than the economic cost of the LNP's inaction has been the cost to our body politic of their toxic and constant identity politics of division. They've spent years dividing Australians and pitting cities against the regions on the issue of climate change. It's meant to be the job of the national government, and particularly the job of the Prime Minister of the day, to unite Australians around important national goals and projects. But when Scott Morrison sneers at the climate concerns of people who frequent city wine bars, when he talks derisively of the goat's cheese circle, when Barnaby Joyce dares to speculate that people who lost their homes in the bushfires were probably Greens voters, they betray that important unifying role. This pandering to identity politics of division makes my blood boil. And now, all of a sudden, worried about their urban seats, these characters announce a road to Damascus conversion, declaring that having divided Australians for so long, they are just the right people to unite Australians around this important national task. Ending the destructive politics of division on climate is going to be a key task of an Albanese Labor government, just as it fell to Bob Hawke and Labor to bring national reconciliation after the divisions and tumultuous decades to leading to 1983, so it will fall to us to bring Australians together in dealing with what is the world's biggest challenge and Australia's biggest economic opportunity. Let's be frank. Our party has paid a big price in these climate wars. We bear the scars. There are some keen observers who predicted that Labor would simply match the coalition's approach to climate to minimise the risk of yet another destructive scare campaign from a government that has no record and no agenda to campaign on. As if signing up to their weak and pathetic targets and effectively endorsing their politics of division might be an effective tactic to convince people to vote Labor. As far as I'm concerned, this was never going to happen. Because while we must, of course, learn the lessons of battles lost, we must ensure we learn the right lessons. The answer is not to eradicate our ambition, but to craft our policies to ensure we can win the argument that climate action is an essential element of, not a brake on, economic growth, investment and jobs. Our policy release last week, Powering Australia, was accompanied by the most substantial modelling ever released by an Australian opposition on any policy ever. We spent this year thinking deeply about how to design our climate policies with maximum economic impact for our country. And this modelling helps us assess and explain just what that impact will be. Several months ago, I outlined 4 principles that would underpin Labor's climate policies. Each of these principles is put into effect in the policies that Anthony and I announced last Friday. First, that net zero by 2050 is an absolutely essential starting point, but it's not enough. The drive to net zero must be accompanied by strong medium-term targets. Secondly, that those targets must be accompanied by substantial and well-designed policy measures. Aspiration is essential, but it's not enough. Third, that good climate policy is good jobs policy, and that should be reflected in the policy design. And fourth, that the regions which have powered Australia for so long must be at the centre of climate change policy going forward. They must not be an afterthought, but an absolutely central point of our policy development, and they have been. Those four principles and the policy we've developed to give them life mean that we can offer the Australian people more jobs, lower power bills, lower emissions. Our 43% emissions reduction target to 2030 is ambitious, but it's also achievable. It isn't an aspiration. It's the emissions reduction outcome of the policies we've designed, put together and put to the Australian people. It's a target with teeth. Inevitably, the Conservatives have derided it as not safe for the economy, and the Greens have argued it sends us off the cliff. Now, it wouldn't have taken a fortune teller to predict those responses, but I was particularly impressed with the fortune-telling ability of both of the parties on this occasion. They both held their press conferences on our policy before it had been released. Mr Morrison's was hours before. Neither had he seen the extensive policy work and the great outcomes for the Australian economy as a result of that work, nor had he seen the modelling, nor had he seen the evidence, and yet he had his lines and his spin ready to go. Their first instinct was to divide again, as it is in their political interests to keep the climate wars going. But it's not in Australia's. The Australian people, fatigued from the last decade, the last 2 years in particular, of the climate wars, deserve so much more than this. They deserve a government with concrete plans and an intention to unite Australians, not divide them, on this most important journey. We're seeking a mandate for our approach to climate change because that's an important first step to building the national unity around this important national agenda. Important too is explaining the principles of our approach that I referred to earlier and how our policies advance those principles. Firstly, that net zero by 2050 is necessary but not sufficient on its own, and we need a strong pathway to get there. And that's why Powering Australia delivers the 43% emissions reduction to 2030. We can't leave the task of net zero to a set of assumptions and a hope about technology emerging in the 2040s, partly because aggregate emissions over the next decade will determine whether the world stays below 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, and partly because of the benefits for the Australian economy of greater ambition in the 2020s, the risk of missing out on the opportunity if we leave it too late. In many ways, the economy of our country is most analogous to Canada's because of our mutual reliance on resources. And I don't think it's an accident that our targets are so similar. While no two countries' policy mix will be the same, Powering Australia's target does return Australia to the sensible approach of similar economies. The second principle was that the target must be accompanied by policies. Now, Scott Morrison says a target without policies is meaningless. I happen to agree with that. But he uses that as an alibi not to have either. I use it as a driver to make sure we have both. Of course, we'd already announced substantial policies before last Friday. Our electric vehicle tax cut, our community battery policy, our 10,000 new energy apprentices, and probably most importantly, rewiring the nation, the urgent upgrade of our grid to unlock renewable energy across the country to improve reliability and resilience. But we always said that wouldn't be enough. And so last Friday we announced much more. That an Albanese Labor government will deliver solar banks to help lower income people and renters get access to the benefits of renewable energy. That a Labor government will ensure that the non-defence elements of the Commonwealth government are net zero by 2030. That a Labor government would introduce real-world vehicle testing to ensure Australian motorists have more accurate information about fuel use and emissions when they buy cars. But inevitably, much of the focus has been on our announcement to improve the safeguard mechanism. Equally inevitably, the government has embarked on their usual scare campaign. Scott Morrison was in Cabinet when the safeguard mechanism was first designed. He was Treasurer when it was introduced. Of course, what we are going to do is take the government's mechanism and properly apply it to a baseline to make it consistent with Australia achieving net zero by 2050. A commitment that the government itself is meant to be adhering to as well. 9 out of the 10 biggest emitting facilities and more than 2/3 of all the facilities covered are committed to net zero by 2050 anyway. Many of them have more ambitious medium-term targets. Our announcement provides a supportive framework for those efforts, including giving industry the certainty that it has been so desperately calling for from the Coalition. The policy was recommended by the Business Council of Australia for that reason. They recommended this approach months ago to ensure that Australian industry can remain competitive in a decarbonising global economy. Indeed, we haven't gone as far as the BCA because, on balance, we don't think the coverage of the scheme should be expanded to additional facilities. I very much welcome the supportive response from the Australian business community over recent days. From the Business Council, that Australia's 2030 target is both sensible and workable, and that in particular they welcome the use of the existing safeguard mechanism. From the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, that Labor's plan is a chance to end climate uncertainty, and that reforms introduce a baseline for the safeguard mechanism that are a sensible approach. And from the Australian Industry Group, that building on the existing safeguard mechanism is an obvious place for any government to start, and that making reductions firm and predictable can help underpin the transformative industry investments. Now, I'd like to think that's hard to argue with, but Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor are arguing. They seem to think they know more about the impact of Labor's policy on Australia's companies than those companies themselves. This is a policy business itself has asked for to keep Australian industry competitive and to drive innovation in a globally decarbonising economy. So if Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor want to debate about the economic impact of our safeguards policy, be my guest. Which brings me to the broader jobs impact of our policy. The third principle I outlined is that climate policy is good jobs policy and must be designed as such. Now, you might have heard me say before, the world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity. And the modelling confirms it. 52 billion of private investment unlocked because of our policies, 64,000 direct jobs and over 600,000 total jobs created by 2030. Power bills cut for households and businesses across the national energy market. This shouldn't come as a surprise, because our independent modelling is very consistent with so much analysis by others. Modelling by Professor Warwick McKibben found a $35 billion jump in GDP by 2030 with a 44% target. Modelling by the BCA and Deloitte shows a 54% target, delivering 195,000 direct jobs over coming decades. And of course, the Reputex modelling for Powering Australia also showed that 5 out of the 6 jobs created by our policies will be in Australia's regions. Again, this shouldn't be a surprise. The regions that have powered Australia for so long will be the regions that power us into the future. The Hunter Valley, the Illawarra, the Latrobe Valley, Central and North Queensland, the Pilbara, Collie-Bunbury. These are the areas that have powered Australia for decades, and they will power Australia for decades to come, with jobs being created there every day with the right policies in place. As we electrify everything that can be electrified, as we make that electricity more and more renewable, as we build the massive storage required through batteries, through hydrogen and through pumped hydro, thousands and thousands of jobs will be created in those regions. And we have the capability to begin manufacturing some of those technologies here with a boost from Labor's National Reconstruction Fund and our Buy Australian plans. Up to this point, we've largely missed out on seizing the opportunities for manufacturing in the new energy industries. Less than 1% of the 60 million solar panels across Australian roofs are made in Australia, despite much of that research and technology being pioneered by Professor Martin Green at the University of New South Wales. Australia is full of smart and hard-working people. It always has been, but we have a government which has turned its back on investing in the future. While we're a wealthy country, Australia's economic complexity as productive knowledge ranks 86th globally, just behind Paraguay and Oman, with the US and the UK at 11th and 12th respectively. Economic complexity is a key hallmark of innovative nations with resilient economies. In an unstable world, increasing innovation and complexity is a down payment on weathering future storms. Australia's regions are ripe to seize the opportunity to develop clean energy and manufacturing industries and export technologies like batteries, renewable technologies, and a world hungry with demand. We have 9 out of the 10 critical minerals for batteries underneath our toes, but we largely send them offshore to be developed, and then we buy them back at a premium. The key to seizing those opportunities is the skills agenda that Anthony announced yesterday. To become a renewable energy superpower, we'll need not only more workers, but more workers trained in the jobs of the future. Yet under the Coalition, there are 85,000 fewer apprenticeships and traineeships today than there were in 2013. 1 in 4 Australian businesses are experiencing skills shortages, and yet there are 2 million Australians unemployed or underemployed. That's why an Albanese Labor government will implement our $1.2 billion Future Made in Australia skills plan. 465,000 free TAFE places, including 45,000 new TAFE places, 20,000 new university places, and crucially to support 10,000 new energy apprentices to train in the jobs of the future. Frankly, we need a government that not only understands the future, but wants to seize it in Australia's best interests. Not fearmonger about it for short-term political gain, but to seize it for the long-term gain of our country. Now, the Australian public, probably many of them in this room as well, are fatigued by the toxic politics we've had in this country on climate change for well over a decade. At the state and territory level, and the business level, at the local government level, people are moving beyond it and getting on with the job. Now, there's almost a unanimous desire to create some policy certainty on the trajectory to net zero and to get on with the job, and for that you need the federal government. This is a pretty remarkable thing and a big change in recent years, but it's a great opportunity for a leader to bring the country together, to be ambitious and to seize the economic opportunities on our doorstep. Instead, the Prime Minister says 43% isn't the right number, it doesn't get the balance right, it's not safe for the economy. He says that before he's even seen the work. The Parliament heard from the Prime Minister a few months ago that if you're committed to net zero, you're automatically committed to a 43% medium-term target. That was before he committed himself to net zero. Now he says he can be committed to net zero without a 43% target. His dishonesty catching up with him yet again. Now he says that 43% isn't safe. Now if Labor's 43% isn't safe, what does the Prime Minister think of New South Wales's 50% by 2030 target? Or South Australia's 50% target? Or Tasmania's 100% target? Are these targets by Conservative state administrations unsafe? When the Prime Minister talks about driving jobs away from Bell Bay and the Hunter, is that directed to Peter Gutwin and Dom Perrottet? The reason Scott Morrison's attack makes no sense is because he only ever cares about the politics of the moment, about the attack grab that works for him in that interview. He doesn't care if it's consistent with what he said before or what he'll need to say in the future. He's always about the directly immediate political opportunity. He only ever thinks of his short-term political interest, never the long-term national interest. And despite the evidence, not just to the boost to the economy of powering Australia, but the huge shift in capital that we risk missing out of with more division, we'll see the scare campaign movie yet again. And we'll see